Right, so Keir Starmer has a new security advisor, and boy do we need to talk about this, because it really does reflect on Starmer somewhat in who his appointee is and what this chap's past track record has been, because he has a considerable one. And to be honest, he really does seem to be the perfect fit for Starmer. Keir Starmer is a man whose previous track record as a supposed human rights lawyer has become a sick joke, and his alleged involvement in the attempted deportation, for example, of Julian Assange to Sweden, as well as other allegations made against his record during his time as Director of Public Prosecutions at the Crown Prosecution Service, have only hardened more and more people's views against him. On top of that, of course, opinion of him has soured all the more because of his lies, stemming from presenting himself as the next Jeremy Corbyn to become Labour leader, to actually being a wannabe Tony Blair on steroids, all the ambition, but none of the political skills or charisma that had Blair fooling all and sundry. It has, of course, cemented Starmer's position as very much that of a red Tory, and a historically unpopular one at that. But his appointee to the post of security advisor taps into every single one of those aforementioned negativities, because he's just appointed a guy called Jonathan Powell, a guy who was Blair's chief of staff for over a decade, and who played an intrinsic role in freeing the then arrested Chilean dictator and mass murderer Augusto Pinochet to avoid extradition. Pinochet versus Assange is how I saw this story, it's how I looked at this story, and Starmer's views of both, and how that reflects on him. Well, it doesn't reflect very well, does it? Right, so Jonathan Powell is the name of Starmer's new security advisor, and whilst the mainstream media is quite happy to cover Powell's track record as an explainer of who this guy is, they pretty much only dug as far as, he worked for Tony Blair, and as far as criticism goes, a comment sought from Diane Abbott was pretty much the summation of the opposition to it. She's saying it is a return of the Blairites, and that is ostensibly very true. But it was the end bit of Sky News' online coverage of this story that made me laugh most of all, when they stated, "Ministers would insist his career history proves he is the best person for the job, and that there are no restrictions on special advisors serving in this post. After the very public fracas around former Downing Street Chief of Staff Sue Gray, the government will hope this back office appointment will pass off with less controversy. Not a chuffing chance as it happens if alternative and independent media have their way, but I'll come on to all of that in a moment. As you might expect, the opposition have already had a moan about all of this, but they too missed the biggest issue. You see, the post of a national security advisor is supposed to be an impartial one. It's supposed to be an advisor advising people on national security. You can't have somebody taking sides in that, can you? Because that could jeopardise national security if your leader happens to be mad. By appointing a blatantly Labour and Labour right-aligned individual to this post, impartiality on matters of national security can be consistently called into question. So Starmer has given the Tories an infinite amount of ammo going forwards here. But additionally, and especially in light of the Tories having lurked even further to the right now that Kemi Badenoch is Tory leader, and her last challenger for that role is honest Bob Jenrick, is now the Shadow Justice Minister, the latter of whom having echoed dusty old nods to British imperialism by bemoaning the fact we've given the Chagos Islands back to Mauritius. Powell was appointed a special envoy by Starmer as part of the negotiations for that handover, so he already had a foot in the door, and now he's walked through it into a nice new cushy role, it seems. For Labour MPs, this appointment and the association with Blair is too much. For a lot of people who were former Labour members and will indeed still be present Labour members if they're still clinging on by the fingertips, this will be too much, especially since Powell was also heavily implicated in the decision to join the Iraq War. Many of them wanted to step away from that part of the party's history. Many politicians today certainly want to distance themselves from it. But Keir Starmer, of course, is Blair on steroids. His words. Blair has certainly never apologised for going into Iraq, has only ever doubled down on it. And a measure of his dishonesty when he betrayed himself to Labour members, Starmer now, as continuity Corbyn, telling them what they wanted to hear to get the job, but not meaning a word of it. It's become Starmer's trademark, of course, ever since, hasn't it? If his lips are moving, he's probably lying. Powell also has links to arms sales. Massive links. And at a time when more and more people and progressive politicians are demanding an end to arms sales to Israel in particular, this is absolutely not a good look either. In 2005, Blair lobbied Saudi Arabia on behalf of BAE Systems, the UK's biggest arms manufacturer with more than 50 sites around the country, and has been supplying Israel with parts for those F-35 jets we keep hearing about, as well as mortars containing white phosphorus and an assortment of other munitions, bombs and artillery. Blair wanted the Saudis to spend £40 billion at the time on BAE Systems Typhoon jets. He was basically lobbying on behalf of an arms company, and later on it was found that the Saudis agreed to do so. But they had conditions, and these included the deportation of Saudi refugees back to Saudi Arabia that were in the UK, dissidents as they put it, and with the Saudis' penchant for head chopping, that wasn't good news for those affected, clearly. Another condition, apparently, was to drop a case being investigated by the Serious Fraud Squad involving alleged bribes paid by BAE Systems to members of the Saudi ruling family. And notably, according to the coverage of this story by Campaign Against the Arms Trade, CAT, the week before, BAE Systems had been accused of paying over £1 million to former Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet as well. Powell, at the time, this Saudi deal was, of course, Blair's chief of staff, and the Guardian at the time alleged that he was promoting this Saudi deal himself quite heavily. Why would he do that? What's in it for him? Well, one possible reason relates to a BAE Systems consultant at that time, and actually he may well still be one. I can't find evidence to state that he has retired from that position, though he may have. And this person was also a former advisor to Margaret Thatcher, and we all know about Blair's fondness and closeness for Margaret Thatcher, seeking to build on her achievements, if you can call them that, I suppose, achieving very little other than destroying this country. Continuity Thatcher as Blair ostensibly was. So this guy also had been a special envoy for Blair to Syria in 2001. So Blair quite liked this guy. He was keeping him around despite his work for Thatcher previously. And later in 2005, after this Saudi deal was going on, he also became Blair's special envoy to Brunei, all while certainly still being on BAE Systems payroll at that. And this guy just happened to be Lord Charles Powell, Jonathan Powell's brother. But it is Jonathan Powell's links to Augusto Pinochet that are, I would think, going to be the most difficult for Starmer and co to explain away, most especially Starmer himself. In 1998, Pinochet, upon a visit to the UK, was arrested under the principle of universal jurisdiction because he was wanted in Spain on charges of having committed genocide, and Spain wanted him extradited to face those charges there. Pinochet was the dictator of Chile from 1973 to 1990, with thousands of citizens in Chile disappeared, tortured and killed under his oppressive regime, which banned other political parties, banned trade unions, stifled free speech, yet still enjoyed very good relations with the usual suspects, as in the US and the UK. Pinochet being close friends with Margaret Thatcher, and the US having given backing to Pinochet's coup to depose the socialist government that came before him, the socialist government of Salvador Allende, declassified files recently revealing that Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger were intrinsic in destabilizing Chile and paving the way for Pinochet's coup in 1973. Well, back to Pinochet under arrest in the UK, though, and in 2000, he was allowed to escape, basically. He got released by then Home Secretary Jack Straw, supposedly on the grounds of ill health, but actually came out as a result of a plan concocted, allegedly, between Tony Blair and the then President of Chile, Eduardo Frei, which also included Spain's then Conservative Prime Minister Jose Maria Aznar and his Foreign Minister Abel Matutes. By this point, Pinochet had been detained for getting on for 2 years in the UK, and no end to the extradition proceedings looked to be in sight, Spain very much holding them up. Not that that should really have been the point or an issue. However, for right-wingers, both here in Blair and his government and abroad, this was proving a bit of an embarrassment, I suppose. But more than that, it would be seen as a massive failure of UK judicial process if Pinochet were to die in the UK. He was getting on a bit, with Straw eventually using his discretion to free Pinochet on health grounds, even though it was never proven that Pinochet was too ill to stand trial. In fact, Pinochet bragged all the time of his fitness in life. And when Pinochet's medical report got leaked, well, it was damned for being skimpy at best. It is how matters even got to that point, though, that Powell comes into this story. To arrange to get Pinochet released required getting Blair and Frei together to discuss that matter for a start. And this involved a Chilean contact and a British one, and these were a chap called Christian Tolosa, who was Frei's press chief, and Jonathan Powell, Blair's chief of staff. Over the course of apparently 6 meetings between the two of them, taking place at number 10, the contact was arranged. Without Powell's involvement, therefore, Pinochet may well have ended up answering for his crimes. As it was, he ended up smuggled out of the country and straight back to Chile via a UK military base to avoid protests and very much avoiding that extradition. This is the man Keir Starmer appointed an advisor on national security. Well, He certainly appears to have had a alleged hand in smuggling people through it, so there's that, I suppose. But contrast that, as I said at the start of this video, with Starmer's determination to see Julian Assange extradited to Sweden. And he gives a top job to a guy who had a hand in seeing freed a man wanted on extradition charges for genocide. And the optics of all of this are that journalism is clearly a bigger crime than genocide is in Keir Starmer's eyes. Starmer, the former human rights lawyer, let's not forget. And that's without even bringing his whole position on Israel into it. But did his belief in human rights only extend as far as for how well it paid him? Because that is very much what it appears to look like these days, doesn't it? Add in the arms sales and that, as I said, relationship with Israel now. And this is, in my opinion, an appointment made in hell. But do let me know what you think of all of this. And please do share, as once more, only independent media are picking this up. Meanwhile, in other matters, the mainstream media are deliberately failing us on talks of pogroms and anti-Semitism once more dominating the headlines as football rioters in Amsterdam, Maccabi Tel Aviv fans, we call them that, their conduct well known around the world, now claiming victimhood, of course, despite them causing the riots, the damage and the shouting of abuse, because the footage doesn't lie, even if various so-called journalists and commentators providing cover for them do. Check out that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next feed. Cheers, folks.